My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 49 years old, and I spend my professional life keeping digital systems secure. Before that, I spent over a decade in the United States Army working in communications intelligence and electronic access control. I understand security the way a surgeon understands anatomy, every layer, every vulnerability, every point of failure. And I understand one thing above all else: the person who controls access controls everything. My grandfather, Roy Hale, purchased 28 acres on the western face of Laurel Ridge in the Blue Ridge Mountains back in 1987, deep hardwood forest, oak and hickory and tulip poplar, with a cold water creek threading through the northeast corner and a gravel road connecting the land to County Line Road. He built a cabin there in 1993, simple and solid. 1,400 square feet of timber frame construction, a stone chimney, a tin roof that rang like music during summer storms, and a porch that faced the mountains with the kind of view that makes city noise feel like a distant rumor. My father inherited that land and used it the same way his father had: fishing in spring, deer season in fall, and long summer weekends watching the ridge change color while the fireflies blinked in the meadow below. He passed it to me when he died, and I kept the tradition. Every Friday afternoon, I drove up that mountain road, closed my laptop, turned off my phone, and let the silence do what nothing else could. The Crestview Commons subdivision appeared around 2009. A developer bought roughly 95 acres east of our property and carved it into 58 residential lots, complete with a community pool, walking paths, and a neighborhood aesthetic committee with more opinions than sense. My land was never part of that development, never part of their HOA association. We shared about 380 feet of split-rail fence along the eastern boundary and nothing else. No shared road, no shared utilities, no shared anything. Sandra Keller moved into Crestview Commons in 2020. She was 56 years old, recently relocated from a larger city, and possessed the kind of relentless organizational energy that pointed in the right direction could rebuild a small country, pointed in the wrong direction it could level one. She ran for HOA board president 4 months after moving in and won because nobody else filed. That single fact tells you most of what you need to know. Within her first year, she had revised the community landscaping code, replaced the property management company, and begun sending formal violation notices to homeowners about fence heights, plant species, and whether decorative lighting was appropriately tasteful. She had opinions about mailboxes. She had feelings about the angle of satellite dishes. The first time she spoke to me directly, I was at the cabin for a weekend and had driven to the community yard sale that had sprawled near the boundary road. She crossed onto my gravel driveway without being invited, extended her hand with the confidence of someone presenting diplomatic papers, and informed me that my access road was creating visual inconsistency with the surrounding neighborhood. She asked if I had considered paving it. I told her my property was not part of her neighborhood. She smiled the way someone smiles when they've decided to win an argument that hasn't started yet, and said, "We're all part of the same community out here, aren't we?" I remembered that smile later. I should have paid more attention to it the first time. My family had maintained a basic tube gate at the entrance to our gravel road since the early 1990s, a padlock, a chain, nothing unusual, more deterrent than fortress. In February of the year things went wrong, I received a letter on Crestview Commons HOA letterhead, signed by Sandra Keller, president, informing me that my gate was obstructing emergency access to the surrounding neighborhood, and that I was required to surrender a key to the HOA within 30 days. The letter referenced something called the Community Emergency Preparedness Protocol, and cited language from the HOA bylaws about coordinated safety access. I read it twice. Then I pulled out my property deed and survey map. My land was not part of the HOA. My gate sat on private property. My gravel road led exclusively to my cabin, with no public designation, no easement, no role in any emergency access plan that had ever been filed with any county office. The gate obstructed nothing except people who had no right to be there. I wrote back a polite letter explaining all of this. I included a copy of my deed and a certified property survey showing the boundaries clearly. 2 weeks later, Sandra sent a second letter, less polite. The HOA board had voted to classify my gate as a safety obstruction. Failure to comply within 15 days would result in a fine of $350 and corrective action. The phrase corrective action was left deliberately undefined. I pinned the letter to my refrigerator and drove up to the cabin for the weekend. When I arrived, my padlock was on the ground, cut clean with bolt cutters. The gate stood open. There were fresh tire tracks on my road. I had installed trail cameras 2 years earlier after finding evidence of ATV riders using my land as a shortcut, standard precaution. The footage showed a gray pickup pulling up the previous Thursday afternoon. A man climbed out, cut the lock in under a minute, and drove through. He returned 11 minutes later, drove out, and left the gate open behind him. The truck had no front plate visible, but I could see a Crestview Commons parking permit in the rear window. I replaced the lock with a hardened steel unit rated for bolt cutter resistance. The following week, that lock was cut too. The second camera I'd added caught the plate this time. The truck was registered to a man named Dale Putnam, who I learned was the HOA's groundskeeper. The footage also captured Sandra Keller's white USV pulling up behind Putnam's truck, waiting at the road while he worked, and then following him through the open gate. She was on my property for 19 minutes. I sat on the porch that evening watching the last light disappear behind the ridge. The air was cool and smelled like damp leaves and pine. The creek made its steady sound through the trees, and I sat with the knowledge that a woman I had spoken to exactly once had just paid someone to cut my lock and drove onto my land like it was a public park. I didn't call the sheriff that night. I thought I could still handle this reasonably. That was the last time I made that mistake. Sandra Keller had just committed a crime on camera, but she wasn't finished. She was about to file the first of what would become a series of complaints designed to weaponize every government agency she could reach against a man who simply refused to hand over a key. The first call to law enforcement came 3 days after I installed a heavier gate. Not just a replacement padlock this time. I sank new steel posts in concrete, hung a reinforced frame gate with a shackle guard welded over the lock, and added 2 cameras angled to capture plates from both directions. It took a full Saturday and cost me around $1,800 in materials. The deputy who knocked on the door of my primary residence was young, maybe 26, and clearly uncomfortable with the errand he'd been sent on. Sandra Keller had filed a formal complaint alleging that I had erected an unauthorized barrier on a shared community access road, and that this barrier posed a hazard to emergency response vehicles. She had attached photographs of my gate and a highlighted copy of the HOA bylaws. I invited the deputy inside. I showed him my property deed, the certified survey, the trail camera footage of Dale Putnam cutting my locks, and the footage of Sandra's SUV following him through the open gate. I explained that the road was private, that no easement existed, and that the HOA had no more jurisdiction over my driveway than it had over the moon. He took careful notes, thanked me, and left. The complaint was closed the same afternoon. No violation found. But Sandra had found a new angle. She noticed that my gravel road, for a stretch of approximately 55 feet, ran within 15 feet of the boundary between my property and the HOA's common area parcel. She hired a surveyor named Terry Voss to examine that section of boundary. Voss placed stakes along the line and produced a report suggesting that a narrow strip of my road might encroach on the HOA's land. He used careful language in the report, phrases like "within measurement tolerance" and "subject to further verification." In plain terms, he was saying he wasn't sure. Sandra presented it to 3 separate county offices as confirmed evidence of encroachment. She sent letters to the county highway department, the local fire marshal's office, and the county planning board, each accusing me of blocking a shared access corridor and requesting emergency review. She copied me on all 3 letters. I read them over dinner in my kitchen and felt something shift from irritation to resolve. I hired Richard Calloway, a licensed professional land surveyor with 29 years of experience in the region, whose certified work was recognized by every county office within 50 miles. Richard came out, performed a full GPS-verified boundary survey, and produced a certified plat showing that the nearest point of my road to the HOA boundary was 13.8 feet, entirely within my property, nowhere near any encroachment. He also reviewed Voss's methodology and noted in writing that the stakes had been placed using outdated reference monuments and that the approach was inconsistent with current state licensing board standards. My attorney, a property rights litigator named Patricia Elms, who had spent 22 years handling HOA disputes and easement claims across the state, sent the certified survey to all 3 agencies, alongside a letter addressing each of Sandra's allegations point by point. Every agency closed their file within 3 weeks. The fire marshal's office called me personally to say the complaint had no factual basis and apologized for the inconvenience. Sandra responded to these closures by calling a special HOA meeting. The agenda had one item: a vote to authorize the board to pursue legal action against me for obstruction of community access and refusal to comply with the emergency preparedness protocol. She framed it as a public safety matter, arguing passionately that if any emergency ever affected the western edge of the subdivision, my locked gate would prevent first responders from using my road as an alternate route. Crestview Commons had two fully compliant access points on the east and south sides of the subdivision, both connected to county roads, both meeting all applicable fire code requirements. My private road had never been designated, designed, or required as an emergency route by any agency with authority to make that designation. The fire marshal had just confirmed this in writing. Sandra knew all of this. She presented none of it. The vote passed 38-11. The HOA's attorney, a man named Jeffrey Crane, who primarily handled commercial lease disputes, sent me a 4-page demand letter requiring me to remove my gate, provide emergency access credentials to the HOA, and pay $2,400 in accumulated fines for ongoing non-compliance. He cited 4 statutes. 3 of them applied to commercial or industrial properties. The 4th was a residential fire code provision that specifically exempted private roads without public access designation. The letter was either poorly researched or deliberately misleading. Given what I later learned about Sandra's direction of the process, I suspected the latter. Patricia did not respond quickly. She responded thoroughly. Her reply ran 11 pages and addressed every claim in Crane's letter with precise statutory citations, attached documentation, and a closing section noting that the HOA's sustained campaign against a non-member property, including 2 documented incidents of lock cutting directed by the board president, could expose board officers to personal tort liability under state law. She enclosed the trail camera footage on a thumb drive. Crane's response was a single paragraph stating that the HOA was evaluating its options. Patricia told me that's what attorneys write when their client has stopped listening and they're not willing to sign anything further. She was right, because what happened next had nothing to do with attorneys and everything to do with Sandra's belief that sheer persistence could substitute for legal standing. She was about to discover exactly how wrong that belief was, and the instrument of that discovery was already on its way to my cabin in a series of shipping boxes. Sandra Keller had failed with padlocks, failed with surveyors, failed with government agencies, and failed with attorneys. So she decided to go over all of them. What she didn't know was that while she was escalating, something far more consequential was quietly being put into motion behind the scenes. I drove up to the cabin on a Thursday evening in late summer and sat on the porch for a long time after the sun went down. The ridge was a black shape against a sky full of stars. The creek was low from the summer heat, making that quiet ticking sound over the rocks. I had a cold drink and my laptop, and a growing understanding that this situation would not end because Sandra Keller ran out of arguments. It would end when she ran out of options. She wanted a key. That was the center of everything, a physical key she could demand on official letterhead, copy without my knowledge, or hand to someone to use at 2 in the morning. Every complaint, every surveyor, every attorney letter was ultimately about creating enough pressure to produce that key. So the solution was not a better lock. The solution was no lock at all. I started researching that evening, not residential security products, commercial and industrial access control systems, the kind used in secure government facilities, data centers, and military installations, the kind I had worked with professionally for years, the kind with no key, no keyhole, no combination, no code, nothing that could be demanded, duplicated, or cut. The components arrived over 2 weeks, and I spent 3 weekends building a system that would permanently end the argument. The gate itself was replaced first. Out came the steel frame gate, and in went a motorized cantilever unit, 12 feet wide, commercial grade, with a fully enclosed drive mechanism, no exposed locking hardware, and an anti-climb top rail. It ran on a sealed electric motor powered by a dedicated solar panel and battery bank. It opened through two methods only: a biometric fob that read my fingerprint and transmitted an encrypted signal, or a smartphone application that required facial recognition before it would send the open command. There was no physical key, there was no code box, there was no combination dial, there was no shackle, there was nothing Dale Putnam could put bolt cutters against, there was nothing Sandra Keller could demand on letterhead, because the thing she was demanding did not exist. At the gate entrance, I mounted a hardened access panel containing a high-resolution camera, a license plate recognition module, and an intercom. Every vehicle that approached was automatically photographed, its plate logged with a timestamp, and the image uploaded to encrypted cloud storage in real time. The intercom allowed two-way communication from anywhere I had a phone signal. If I chose not to answer, the gate stayed closed. There was no secondary option, no override, no emergency bypass, no alternative entry point. Along the shared boundary fence, I installed vibration sensors on every post, infrared motion detection in the tree line at 30-foot intervals, and 4 cameras covering the full 380 feet of shared line from overlapping angles. All solar-powered, all uploading continuously, all time-stamped and position-tagged. The logging system recorded every event in the tamper-resistant database with automatic off-site backup, every camera trigger, every intercom attempt, every license plate, every footstep within sensor range. The record was permanent and automatic. It required nothing from me to maintain. I also did something I had been putting off out of a misplaced hope that things would settle down on their own. I filed a formal criminal complaint with the county sheriff's office against Dale Putnam for the 2 lock-cutting incidents. I provided the trail camera footage, the before and after photographs of the cut locks, the license plate captures, and a detailed timeline. Patricia sent a companion letter to the HOA putting them on formal written notice that any future unauthorized entry onto my property would result in immediate civil action against the HOA as an organization, against its officers personally, and against any contracted agents. The detective assigned to the case, a 17-year property crimes veteran named Carl Benton, reviewed the footage and interviewed Putnam. Putnam cooperated. He provided a signed statement explaining that Sandra Keller had told him the road ran through community-adjacent land and that the HOA had authority to maintain access. He said she had supplied the bolt cutters. He said he hadn't known the road was private property. The detective told me charges were being prepared against Putnam for criminal trespass and against Sandra under the state's accessory liability statute for directing her actions. The paperwork would move through the DA's office over the next several weeks. I didn't tell anyone. I mounted a polished aluminum sign on the new gate, laser engraved, capital letters: private property, biometric access only, no keys, no codes, no exceptions, all approaches recorded and logged. I stood back and looked at it in the afternoon light. The cameras blinked, the solar panels angled toward the sun. The gate gleamed like an answer to a question Sandra had been asking for 2 years. The question was, where is the key? The answer was, there isn't one. There never will be. What Sandra didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the HOA's insurance carrier had not simply moved on after sending their initial warning letter. They had assigned an internal investigator to the dispute. Her name was Angela Whitmore, and she had been quietly pulling every document related to the Bain property matter for weeks: meeting minutes, invoices, complaint records, legal correspondence. She was building a picture, and the picture was not flattering. She had a meeting scheduled with the full HOA board in 3 weeks. She hadn't told them what was in her file. She had only said it was a routine coverage review. The gate was finished, the criminal charges were in motion, the insurance investigation was building toward a confrontation Sandra had no idea was coming. But Sandra was about to make one final move, the worst decision of her entire campaign. She was going to hand me everything I needed on a silver platter, in broad daylight, in front of 30 witnesses and a camera she never noticed. In Part 4, she organizes her own undoing and calls it a community event. Sandra discovered the new gate on a Monday morning. My license plate system logged her arrival at 10:24 a.m. She pulled up in her white SUV, sat for 47 seconds, then pressed the intercom button. I was at my desk in the city, watching the live feed on my phone. I let it ring. She pressed it 3 more times over the following 2 minutes. Then she got out of her car. She walked to the gate and examined it the way someone examines a locked door when they've lost the key and are slowly realizing there isn't one. She ran her hands along the frame. She looked at the locking mechanism, or rather looked for a locking mechanism, and found a sealed motor housing with no accessible hardware. She crouched down and looked along the bottom rail. She stood up, took 4 photographs with her phone, and left. My system logged everything. 14 images from 3 camera angles, 1 2-minute video, 4 intercom attempts, 0 access granted. By Wednesday, she had filed a new complaint with the sheriff's office alleging that my camera system constituted unlawful electronic surveillance of a residential neighborhood. The deputy who responded, the same young officer who had now been to my property 3 times on Sandra's complaints, confirmed that all cameras were aimed at my property and the public road, and that no surveillance of private residential space had occurred. He closed the complaint in 18 minutes. Before leaving, he mentioned to me that his supervisor had begun tracking the pattern of complaints from the same address and was becoming increasingly skeptical. Sandra sent a letter to every Crestview Commons homeowner the following Thursday. A board member named Evelyn Cross, a retired nurse who had grown deeply uncomfortable with Sandra's leadership style, shared a copy with me through Patricia's office. The letter described my gate as a hostile and intimidating structure designed to make our neighbors feel unwelcome and unsafe. It characterized the biometric system as surveillance technology targeting Crestview families. It proposed a special assessment of $9,000 to fund litigation, compelling me to provide emergency access credentials. The vote at the special meeting was 33 to 15. 15 people asked questions. Evelyn Cross was one of them. She stood up and asked Sandra directly whether the HOA's attorney had confirmed they had legal standing to demand access credentials from a private property owner who was not a member of the HOA. Sandra said the attorney was reviewing the question. Evelyn said that wasn't what she'd asked. Sandra moved to the next question. The following Saturday, Sandra organized what she called a community safety awareness walk. Residents would gather at the shared boundary fence and walk its length, documenting the impact of my, and I'm quoting her Facebook post here, hostile security installation on neighborhood well-being. She expected 50 people. About 30 attended. My boundary cameras recorded the entire event from the moment the first car parked on the HOA side of the fence line. For the first 40 minutes, Sandra led the group along the fence on the Crestview side, narrating through a bullhorn about community rights and access equity and what she described as one man's decision to hold an entire neighborhood hostage. People listened, some nodded, most looked mildly uncertain about whether they should be there. Then Sandra stepped over the fence. Not dramatically, she simply lifted 1 foot over a low rail section and walked approximately 12 feet onto my land, still speaking through the bullhorn, still gesturing at my cameras and gate as though she were leading a guided tour. 3 people followed her across the boundary. I later identified them through plate and facial records as board members Thomas Wick, Renata Castles, and Brian Moran. The remaining 26 people stayed on the Crestview side of the fence. Several of them visibly shifted away from the line. Sandra pointed at my nearest boundary camera and said, at full bullhorn volume with 30 witnesses present, "This right here is what happens when someone decides their paranoia matters more than this community. You don't have the right to lock us out of our own neighborhood." She was standing 12 feet inside my boundary border when she said it. She was being recorded by 3 cameras she knew about and 1 she didn't. That 4th camera was a telephoto lens. Mira Callahan, a staff writer for the regional newspaper who covered municipal and community governance issues, had seen Sandra's Facebook event and driven out to observe. She was parked on County Line Road with a clear line of sight to the fence and had been shooting since the group arrived. She photographed the fence crossing. She photographed Sandra mid-speech with the bullhorn. She photographed the 4 trespassers standing on my land with my no trespassing signs visible in the background. I was watching the live feed from my kitchen table. I did not call the sheriff. I called Patricia. Patricia called Detective Benton. Benton said the existing warrants for Sandra and Putnam were in final processing, but that the new footage substantially strengthened the case and would support additional charges against the board members who had crossed the fence. He asked me to send the clips that afternoon. I sent them within the hour. Mira Callahan called me that afternoon asking for comment. I told her I was happy to speak on the record once the legal proceedings were further along, and gave Patricia's number. Patricia, who understood precisely how useful a well-documented news story could be at the right moment, gave Mira a careful factual summary of everything: the lock cutting, the false complaints, the fraudulent survey, the insurance warning Sandra had concealed from the membership, the pending criminal charges. Mira said she was writing a feature piece. On Monday morning, Patricia filed a civil complaint in the County Superior Court. Defendants, the Crestview Commons HOA as an organization, Sandra Keller personally, Dale Putnam, and the 3 board members who had crossed the fence. Claims: criminal trespass, tortious interference with property rights, harassment, abuse of legal process, and civil conspiracy. Damages sought: $72,000. The complaint was a public record from the moment it was filed. The civil suit was filed, the criminal warrants were ready, the newspaper story was being written, and in 3 days, the HOA's insurance investigator was going to walk into a board meeting with a folder 2 inches thick and end Sandra Keller's reign in a single evening. Angela Whittemore arrived at the Crestview Community Center on a Thursday evening at 6 p.m. with a colleague, a rolling briefcase, and a folder that represented 4 weeks of quiet, methodical document review. All 5 board members were present. Approximately 22 homeowners had come to observe, including Evelyn Cross, who had positioned herself in the 3rd row with a notepad. Angela thanked the board for their time. She set her folder on the table, and then she stopped being warm. She outlined what her investigation had found. The HOA had spent $16,200 in community operating funds on legal fees, surveyor's costs, contractor invoices, and meeting expenses, all directed at a property the HOA had no jurisdiction over and no legal relationship with. 2 incidents of criminal trespass had been committed by a contracted HOA agent acting on the direct written and verbal instructions of the board president. 4 complaints had been filed with law enforcement, all closed as unfounded. A surveyor's report had been commissioned and presented to government agencies as evidence of encroachment, despite the fact that the board had already received a certified opposing survey on file with the county. A special assessment had been levied and collected for litigation expenses, despite the fact that the HOA's own attorney had declined to endorse the suit. A board resolution had been passed in closed session attempting to reclassify a private road as a shared access corridor without any supporting documentation or agency designation. The room was very quiet. Angela informed the board that effective immediately, the HOA's liability policy was being reclassified to high-risk status. Annual premiums would increase by 65% beginning in January. More significantly, the carrier was formally excluding coverage for any legal fees, settlements, or judgments arising from the Bain property dispute, because the board had received an explicit written warning to discontinue these actions 7 months ago and had chosen not to comply. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Evelyn Cross stood up and read aloud from printed paper she had brought specifically for this purpose, the full text of the insurance carrier's original warning letter, the one Sandra had described to the board as overcautious and dismissed without a membership vote. She read it clearly and completely. Then she asked Sandra to explain why the membership had never been informed that the carrier had warned against continuing these actions. Sandra began to speak. She was 3 sentences into an explanation about community unity and proactive governance when the community center door opened. Detective Carl Benton walked in with a uniformed officer. He introduced himself to the room, stated that he had legal documents requiring his attention, and asked Sandra Keller and Dale Putnam to step outside. Putnam, who had been sitting near the back of the room with the expression of a man who had been expecting this for weeks, stood immediately. Sandra stood slowly. She appeared to be making calculations, reviewing options, finding none. Benton served the warrants on the sidewalk outside. Criminal trespass for Putnam, criminal trespass and accessory charges for Sandra covering her direction of the lock-cutting incidents. He also informed Thomas Wick, Renata Castles, and Brian Moran that they would receive civil summons related to the fence crossing incident the following week. Inside the community center, someone turned off the projector. The room buzzed with low, urgent conversation. Homeowners who had voted for the special assessment were doing the arithmetic on what $16,200 of their money had purchased. People who had trusted Sandra's assurances about strong legal standing were reconsidering what strong ever meant in that context. Evelyn Cross addressed the room after Benton and the officers had gone. She said clearly and without drama that the board had spent community funds pursuing legal authority it did not have, ignored professional advice that the campaign was unjustifiable, concealed that advice from the membership, and in doing so had exposed every homeowner in the subdivision to increased insurance costs and uninsured legal liability. She said she was requesting a special election to address board leadership, and she was prepared to begin that process the following morning. Nobody objected. Mira Callahan's article published Friday morning. The headline read, HOA President Arrested on Trespass Charges Following Year-Long Property Dispute. The piece was thorough, documented, and precise. It included photographs of the gate, the boundary fence, and Sandra mid-speech on my property with the bullhorn raised. It quoted Patricia, the fire marshal's clearance letter, and the deputy's observation about the pattern of unfounded complaints. It quoted Sandra's Facebook post calling my gate a hostile and intimidating structure, placed directly alongside the photograph of Sandra standing on my land holding a bullhorn. The article was shared 1,400 times in the first 48 hours. I read it Saturday morning on the cabin porch with coffee and the smell of the mountains coming through the trees. A red-tailed hawk was working the thermals above the meadow, patient and precise, circling without effort. I watched it for a while, then I went inside and split some wood. The arrests were made, the article ran, the insurance company had spoken. But the story wasn't finished. The criminal charges still needed resolution, the civil suit still needed a verdict, and Sandra Keller still lived next door to the subdivision whose trust she had spent 2 years spending. The criminal cases moved through the system over the following months with the unhurried thoroughness that the legal process tends to produce when the evidence is clear and both sides know it. Dale Putnam entered a plea agreement 4 months after the warrants were served. He pleaded to a single count of misdemeanor trespass. The court recognized his cooperation with investigators, his signed statement, and his lack of prior record. He received a $600 fine and 6 months of unsupervised probation. He sent me a handwritten letter 2 weeks after sentencing. He wrote that he was sorry, that he should have asked more questions before acting on another person's say-so, and that he hoped I understood he hadn't known the road was private. I wrote back and told him I believed him and appreciated the letter, and I meant it. Sandra's case was resolved through a plea agreement the following month. She pleaded to 2 counts of misdemeanor criminal trespass and 1 count of directing criminal activity. The judge, apparently familiar with the scope of the campaign through the public record, declined to treat this as a minor nuisance matter. Sandra received a suspended sentence, 24 months of supervised probation, a $2,000 fine, and a permanent protective order prohibiting her from contacting me, entering my property, or filing any administrative complaint related to my land with any government agency. The protective order was indefinite, pending a showing of rehabilitation. The civil case settled 8 months after filing. The HOA's insurance carrier, having formally excluded the dispute from coverage, left the board to negotiate using operational funds. After 3 mediation sessions, the parties agreed to a settlement of $47,000. $31,000 came from HOA operational reserves and the recently levied special assessment funds, which the court found had been collected under materially misleading representations to the membership. $16,000 came from Sandra Keller personally. The settlement covered my attorney fees, the cost of the security system, surveying expenses, travel and time costs over the 2-year dispute, and a compensatory damages component. Sandra Keller was removed from the HOA board by special election the week after her plea. The vote was 51-3. She listed her house with a real estate agent in October. By the first week of December, the house was sold and she was gone. I never encountered her again. Thomas Wick and Renata Castles resigned from the board before their civil summonses were formally served and participated in a mediated resolution that required them to issue written apologies to the membership and reimburse a portion of legal costs personally. Brian Moran issued a public written apology at the next general membership meeting and was permitted to remain on the board at the membership's discretion. He served out his term quietly and did not seek re-election. Evelyn Cross was elected board president in the special election. The vote was unanimous. She called Patricia's office the following week and asked to meet. She came to the cabin on a Saturday morning in early spring, a time when the tulip poplars were just beginning to open and the creek was running high and cold from snowmelt. She brought a dish of homemade food and a copy of the newly revised HOA governing documents, which now contained, among other changes, a provision explicitly stating that the association had no jurisdiction over adjacent private properties, that no officer or agent of the HOA could authorize entry onto non-member land under any circumstances, and that any member who directed such entry on behalf of the association would be personally liable for resulting damages without indemnification from the HOA. She asked if there was anything the community could do to mark a genuine new beginning. I thought about it for a moment. Then I asked for one thing. I asked the HOA to install a boundary marker at the point where the shared fence line met County Line Road, a simple post with a small plaque identifying the property line clearly so that anyone walking the boundary would know exactly where private land began. Not as a monument to the dispute, as a reference point for everyone who came after, so no future resident would have the excuse of confusion and no future board member could claim the boundary was unclear. Evelyn said they would take care of it. They installed the marker in November. The plaque was engraved in clean block letters, Crestview Commons HOA boundary, private property beyond this point. I used part of the settlement to make improvements to the cabin my father never got around to. A new wood stove, properly fitted, replacement boards on the sections of porch that had softened with age, a good reading chair in the corner by the fireplace where my grandfather used to sit. Small things, things that made the place feel more like what it had always been, a place to be still. I also wrote a check for $2,500 to the local volunteer fire department, the same department Sandra had attempted to mobilize against me in her complaint to the fire marshal's office. The donation went toward a new extraction kit. The fire chief sent a thank you note and said they'd put it to good use. The gate still stands, the cameras still run, the sign still reads what it read the day I mounted it. The system logs every approach, every motion, every intercom press, every license plate that comes down the road. Most of what it records these days is wildlife. A doe and 2 fawns who visit the meadow at dusk. A black bear who walks up to the nearest camera every few weeks, sniffs the lens, and wanders off with the relaxed authority of someone who has decided not to be impressed. On Friday evenings, I still drive up that gravel road. I open the gate with my fingerprint. I park under the oaks. I sit on the porch where my father sat, and his father before him. The ridge goes through its colors as the sun drops. The creek does its patient work over the stones. The lightning bugs appear in the meadow one at a time, and then all at once. And not a single person on this earth has a key to my front gate except me. That's the way it was always supposed to be. If your HOA has ever treated your property line like a suggestion, if they've ever confused their committee authority with actual legal power, if they've ever demanded access to something that was never theirs to begin with, share your story in the comments. I read every one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now.